Let's now talk about one of the most common tactical methods to both use and to watch out for in chess, and that is the double attack. Now, the double attack is what the name suggests. It's an attack on more than one target. Now, it doesn't have to be an attack on simply two rooks, as in this example. Now, it doesn't have to be an attack on two pieces. It can be an attack on one piece and a pawn. It can be an attack on the piece and also the enemy king. But it is simply an attack on two targets. Here I have put on the board a very, very simple introductory example. Now imagine if you were white. Of course, this position is kind of ridiculous because there are no kings on the board and so it is not legal. But if you were white, the best move that you could play would be to fork the rooks. Of course, a fork can be a type of double attack. You could fork these two rooks on b7 and g2 by playing with your bishop the move bishop to d5. Now, were you to do so, you would be attacking the two rooks at the same time, and therefore you would be winning material. Now, that's a really, really simple example. So what we're going to do is we're going to show some more advanced examples now. But just one thing to point out, and that is that every single piece has the potential to create a double attack. For example, in this position here, we use a pawn by playing the move d4 to create a double attack on the black rooks on c5 and e5. And what we can say about this again is that this is a fork. But a fork is not exactly synonymous with a double attack. And the reason why is because while a double attack can be considered to be a fork, you could describe a double attack such as this one or the previous example as a fork isn't limited to an attack of two pieces or a piece and a pawn or two targets, right? So for example, you could have a fork where you fork 5 pieces, and therefore we cannot consider the two things to be exactly the same. But then again, these things are not the most important points, but I just wanted to mention it. Now we take a look at an example involving a knight with the move knight to e4. And again, the white knight is attacking both of the black rooks. So we've seen so far a bishop, a knight, and a pawn, but let's take a look at some, real life examples of double attacks that are not quite as obvious in every case as the ones that we've looked at until now. Here, white wanted to target this pawn on e4, and so he played the move rook to e1. But he made a big mistake, because with this move, black has the response bishop takes f2 check, and we see a double attack on the white king and the rook, and the game was immediately over. White resigned. Sometimes these can be a little bit more tricky to spot, these kind of moves, simply because the bishops being long-range pieces, if we take a couple of steps back, here in this position, white is concerned about this pawn, right? Wants to place the rook on e1 to grab the pawn. And, it's relatively easy to miss that bishop that is parked on the queen side and forget about its influence on this point of f2. So let's move on to the next example. Here we have, again, an example where the king is attacked, but this time it's the king and a pawn. And this is actually a very common idea that has won and lost many games for many players over the years. And that is the move queen to b5 check. And we see the king is under attack, as is the pawn on b7. And the real problem of this particular move is not so much losing a pawn, but the fact that after you lose the pawn, especially if black plays a move like king to d8, then here white will capture the pawn on b7, and this rook is impossible to save. And even if, for example, black plays the move knight to d7, which is relatively best in this position, still after the move queen takes b7, we see that the queen is forking the rook and the pawn on e4. And why am I not describing this as a double attack? Well, because the queen is also threatening to capture on c7. And in fact, if the rook moves, which it probably will, then the queen is also targeting the pawn on a7. So as we can see, if you are forking two pieces, we can call that a double attack, but you can be forking more than two pieces or a selection of targets, such as in this example, and then this particular position, we cannot call it a double attack. Here we have a little bit trickier one to spot, actually a game taken from one of my games, a position taken from one of my games, I should say. And here I, as white, wanted to somehow get this bishop into play, right? So if we notice, I can't bring the bishop to b2 because that square is very, very well covered. Similarly, I can't take the bishop to a3. And so out of a desire to bring this piece that is currently in its starting square into play, I played the move e4. And I thought this was a very good move, but my opponent responded with the very clever move knight to d6 with a nasty double attack on my pawn and my rook. And there is no way for me to defend because I certainly have to move my rook. And the only way that I could defend the pawn with my rook, so deal with both threats, would be if I played either rook b4, because this way I would be defending, or rook e7. Again, we see that it's like a square. However, neither of these moves are available to me, simply because the b4 square is covered by the pawn, and the e7 pawn is defended by his bishop. So, as a result, this fork, which is also a double attack, cost me the pawn. Okay, let's take a look at one or two a little bit more complicated examples. Here, white is actually doing quite well, but he makes a mistake. He plays the move h4, and his intention is, of course, to play h5 and to try and chip away at the enemy king. But the problem is that this bishop right here on b2 is undefended. And so after the move queen to d2 by black, he targets the bishop, but also targets the pawn on f4. And if we notice, this pawn on f4 was already being attacked once, and so now it has a second attacker. And because only one white piece is defending, that is the white queen, so therefore white cannot avoid losing material. So if white plays, for example, bishop to c3, black will capture on f4. And that is a very, very important pawn because he also, in targeting the white queen, makes sure that white does not have enough time to play a move like h5 with a nasty attack. Okay, let's take a look at one more example. This time around, you are black, and try and figure out if you can see the best move. Let's take a look. Feel free to pause, of course, if you haven't found the move, and resume whenever you have. So here, once again, black has the move queen to b6, and with his queen targets the point on f2 and also the point on b2. We can say that he targets the b2 pawn directly with his queen, but he targets the f2 pawn indirectly, because what he does is he brings one more attacker onto this f2 point and supports the bishop in threatening to capture. And in fact, in both cases, the threat is not just to win a pawn, because the problem for white is, let us imagine that he simply does nothing. So let's imagine that he plays the move h3, which would be, of course, a very silly move. The problem is that after bishop takes f2, there is a second double attack on this undefended knight, and so a lot of material will be lost. And so we might say, well, in that case, let's just forget about the pawn on b2 and let's play a move such as castle, which defends the point on f2. But the problem here is that black will capture on b2, and in doing so creates another nasty threat on this undefended rook. In fact, we could actually put an advanced puzzle here and ask, how do you play as white? How do you avoid, just resigning because you're going to apparently lose a rook? And the clever answer is that white fortunately has this move knight to a3. You might be thinking, well, black has two attackers, so surely this is no good. But the point is that after bishop takes knight, in fact, white would have a draw because of the move rook to b1. Attacking the queen can only go to a2, and now white simply goes rook back to a1. And we see that the queen cannot go to b3 because it will get taken, and likewise with c4. And so therefore, the best thing that black can do in this situation is queen to b2, rook back to b1, and we have a draw by repetition. Of course, black should not capture the knight on a3, but instead perhaps even retreat the queen back to b6 and be happy to be up a pawn. We can say that this position is extremely good for black, but not quite winning just yet. Still, hopefully that was an interesting little side point for you guys, and that concludes the section on double attack. So I will see you in the next section.